Welcome to Forums That Matter, a community service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Jonathan Glauser. I'm a member of the Forum Committee, and I'm the coordinator of today's discussion, which has both remote and in-person audiences. Our topic today is, why is it so expensive to be poor? And we'll have Q&A from about 9:30 until 10. A committee member will provide a mic for our in-person audience. We ask our virtual audience to put questions in the Q&A box. Also, virtual viewers can turn closed captioning on or off at the bottom of the screen. Please be sure that your phones are off or in airplane mode. This program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website at uucleveland.org. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Our speakers today are Chris Knestrick and Emily Campbell. Chris Knestrick is the Executive Director of the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. He has over 10 years of experience working in homelessness in Cleveland, and he has also directed advocacy efforts in the international and local community. Chris is committed to community organizing, undoing oppression, and promoting nonviolence that centers the voices of those most impacted by public policy. His work has taken him from the streets of Cleveland to the mountains of Columbia, where I just found out he was for approximately 5 years. He's a graduate of the McCormick Theological Seminary. He likes to spend his days boating, fishing, and thinking about how to get the community to love so fiercely that homelessness is unimaginable. Emily Campbell serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Community Solutions, overseeing research, policy, and administration related activities. Emily previously worked for a U.S. Congressman, and she has consulted with numerous nonprofits, foundations, and government agencies to provide data and public policy decision support. Her work on poverty has appeared in every major newspaper in Ohio. He's been interviewed by a wide variety of media outlets, including The Economist, the New York Times, ESPN.com, MSNBC, and NPR. He's immediate past chair of the board of directors of the Literacy Cooperative and was named one of Cleveland's 40 under 40 by Crane's Cleveland Business. Campbell holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and a Master of Arts in Political Science from Case Western Reserve University. Emily and Chris, it's yours.
Great, thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to start and then turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit more. Thank you so much for having us here this morning. I'm from the Center for Community Solutions. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank working to improve health, social, and economic conditions for people here in the greater Cleveland area, as well as across the state of Ohio. We focus on applied research, public policy and advocacy, and strategic communication. So we, as a think tank, we of course study issues, but we also actively engage in policy to try and change things and to try and enact some systemic change to address some of the issues that I know we're going to talk about today. So our charge is to talk about, why is it so expensive to be poor? No one wants to live in poverty. The child poverty rate is several times the poverty rate for older adults, for working age adults. No children chooses to be born into a family that is living in poverty, but far too many children in our community are. In fact, close to half of the children in the city of Cleveland are living in poverty, and the data stays very similar every single year. The reality is that our systems aren't set up to make it easy for people to climb out of poverty once they find themselves in a challenging situation. We like to think about the path from poverty to self-sufficiency or prosperity or economic independence or whatever you want to call it. We like to think of that path as an escalator where you get on, you get a good job, and you just ride to the top. It doesn't work that way. It actually operates a little bit more like a roller coaster, Where there are starts and stops, there can be rapid ascents and quick drops as people are moving through. So there are close to 200,000 people in Cuyahoga County who are living in poverty. It's about 1 out of every 6 or 7 residents in our county. Now, of course, we see concentrations within the city of Cleveland, in the inner ring suburbs, but there are people who are living in poverty in every corner of our community. Every single one, including Gates Mills, including Hunting Valley, there are people who are living below the poverty threshold. There are also a number of people who are living in deep poverty, that is 50% of the poverty threshold, although those are smaller numbers. And when we talk about poverty, what I'm talking about often are the official poverty statistics, the level that's set by the federal government, where if your household income is above, you're not in poverty. If it's below, you are living in poverty. For a family of 3 in 2024, it's about $25,000 a year, almost $26,000 a year. If you earn more than that, you're not considered to be poor. But what we know is that people need much more money than that to get by and to get by independently. MIT puts out a living wage, and for that same family of 3, you remember their poverty threshold was $25,000. It's $80,000 that family would need to be able to pay for all of their needs and their basic expenses without any help from anyone else, family, friends, charity and philanthropy, nonprofit organizations. That $80,000, crucially for this family, also counts full-time childcare, the full cost of full-time childcare, which is a growing need and a growing expense for families with children that is simply unaffordable. So poverty at its core is a lack of resources. The reality is that someone can work here in Ohio for our minimum wage, which is over $10 an hour. They can work for the full year, full time, talking 40 hours a week, all 52 weeks of the year, and still not earn enough to be even above that poverty threshold. So too many jobs are paying too little. And in fact, there are thousands of people living in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 5,000 people, who last year worked full time for the full year, but didn't earn enough to bring their families out of poverty. And why do we care about poverty? Well, of course, there are moral reasons that we don't want to see people struggling and suffering. There's also economic reasons, some very real economic reasons that mean that poverty is a challenge. And there are health reasons that poverty is a challenge. Emerging research is showing the connections between brain chemistry, between physiology, and between the stress that living in poverty and growing up in poverty causes, because people have to make very, very difficult choices. The biggest expense for people living in poverty is time. Our systems, our public systems of support are very difficult to manage. They're not designed to get people help and get people help quickly. They are, on the other hand, designed to make it more difficult, to prove that you really need it, to show that you don't have any other resources, having to constantly prove that. And they're set up where you have to go in person for a lot of things. Now, this pause during the pandemic, the in-person, the redeterminations are starting to come back, have come back in large part. And Ohio is one of only 8 states that still requires that new families and families with new babies have to go in person to get their WIC card regenerated. They have a card that they can use, but in order to refill it, they have to go to an office in person. Can you imagine being a new parent with a newborn that doesn't have enough to be able to feed your baby and yourself, having to get yourself in person, wait in line, go through these things? We ask people who are struggling to do things that none of us would want to do. We would all give up. Wait times at the county on the phone are several hours. We're working directly with the county to try and work on that, but it's a very difficult problem, especially when you're trying to work and take care of your family. So it's been a little bit of doom and gloom that I've talked about. Let's talk about some things that work to help. The Center for Community Solutions is working on solutions to try and do things, what we call incentivized work. It plays well with our friends in Columbus. This idea that we want to make sure that work pays and we're not penalizing people or taking away their benefits as they continue to work more. One of the most effective programs has been tax credits. There was the child tax credit for just a short period of time during the pandemic. It was improved. It worked. During the time of the child tax credit enhancement, child poverty was effectively cut in half in this country. And when they expired, the enhancements expired, it went right back to where it was before. And there is often this idea that people living in poverty don't know how to use their money the right ways, or we want to control how folks are using their money. What the child tax credit enhancements showed is that when people have additional resources, they tend to use it for exactly the kinds of things that policymakers would hope. So for about 6 months, the child tax credit was making prepayments directly deposited into the bank accounts of millions of American families. About 95% of Ohio families with children benefited from this program. And it was dollars that were deposited in someone's bank account that they could use however they saw fit. No restrictions. In September 2021, after these had been rolling out for a couple of months, the federal government, the Census Bureau asked Ohioans, how are you using those dollars if you're receiving them? 50% of the people who spent some of the money spent it on food. 37% spent it on clothing, and 34% spent at least some of it on utilities and telecommunications. So food, clothing, utilities are the three things that people use their money for. It adds up to more than 100 because you could use the money for lots of different things. Clothing surprised some people, but what's happening in August and September in Ohio? It's back to school time. Shopping for shoes so that kids can participate in phys ed and in their activities, shopping for clothes, shopping for other things that the students need. And so again, time after time, we saw that people spent the money exactly how we would hope. Research out of several different national think tanks has shown that it didn't reduce people working. So it was enough money to help families with some of their needs, to be able to save for their education or their children's education, to be able to pay down debt. We saw all of these things happening during the time, but it wasn't enough to convince parents to stay home. So it really worked. Back of the envelope math, Community Solutions estimated that 10,000 children in Cleveland were lifted out of poverty because of this program, but it ended. So we're working with the state to see if we can get a state version of the child tax credit to improve some other tax credits. We're thinking about enhancements in tax credits for caregivers, recognizing that caregivers of both children and older adults have an awful lot of uncompensated work that they do, and it can cause a lot of economic pressures. And so thinking about how can we support caregivers, not through another program, but through a tax credit, because who doesn't love a tax cut? So that there's less control by government over some of these things. What we see is that people in poverty are forced to make tough choices, and those choices have costs. They know that the costs are going to have to come to bear later. We recently did a survey in collaboration with a couple of other groups in Cleveland focused on Cuyahoga County residents that were earning $35,000 a year or less. What we found is that 62% of those people said that they had to make at least one trade-off, at least sometime in the last year, because they didn't have enough resources to be able to cover all of their expenses. The most common trade-off was that they were choosing between food or utilities, food or transportation, and food or housing, or food and medical care. We know that when people don't get the health care and the medical care that they need, there are consequences for their health, and it becomes expensive for all of us. The other thing that happens in a high poverty community is that there aren't enough resources to be able to invest in infrastructure, to be able to invest in good schools, be able to invest in all of the things that make the really thriving community. So at Community Solutions, we talk about how in order to have a thriving greater Cleveland, we have to make sure that the people here are thriving as well. It's not enough to just have beautiful parks. We need to make sure that we are taking care of people, and people aren't forced to choose between fixing their roof or fixing their car or some of these other things that none of us would want to have to choose about. So there are a lot of people who are living very close to the edge, who one large expense they don't know where they're going to be able to afford that expense, whether it is a car repair that they need, or investing in some tuition for themselves or their children, or something else. And so it causes all of these very difficult choices that in the end cost all of us. I'm happy to answer questions when we get there, but I want to make sure we have lots of time to hear from Chris as well to talk a little bit more in detail about housing in particular and the importance of stability in that area.
Thank you. Again, Chris Knestrick. I work at the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you today and have a conversation around these issues. I'm interested in kind of doing some work around and talking this from a perspective of homelessness and like what ends up happening around when someone's homeless and why does it cost so much to simply get out of homelessness for an individual. But I often start for like, why does homelessness exist in our community? And like one of the, and looking at that, and I think the first thing we always come to is just affordable housing, right? And going back to the living minimum wage here in Ohio, when we think around $10 an hour, where would that get you? And I think it's really important is how many hours a single mother would have to work to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. Does anyone have a guess? It's actually 73 hours a week would allow you to afford a 2-bedroom apartment to house your family in. But what we know is that that's an impossible task, right? Like no one would want to ask anyone to be working 74 hours a week, but that's the reality in the current wage and labor scene in Ohio. And that like, there's also the reality that affordability is just hard to find, right? Like statistically in our kind of community, we see that Cleveland has around 91,000 extremely low income renting households. And there's just really only around 34,000 affordable housing units available throughout the community. And so just being able to find it becomes very difficult. And in terms of that, some of the lowest thing is like someone that is on an SSI check or a disability check, right, and making around $900 a month, they would have to be able to find a unit around $300 a month to be able to adequately afford that place, which is an impossible feat, right? I mean, in our market or, in any market going around, you're never going to find even an SRO or a rooming house that would meet that need for you. So like housing affordability becomes a huge issue, but in terms of like someone that is currently living in our shelters, trying to get into housing, like what does that path look like, right? You would first need a bus pass that costs $5.50 a day, right, to get to anywhere. And so you times that by, so you have to have that. And then you have to be able to afford application fees, right? So every application you put in will charge you a fee. And so you have to have money that would be able to cover the application fee, right? And then landlords will do a credit check, right? And we know that, I don't know about, I mean, I don't have great credit but like how many people are able to even pass a simple credit check? And so when we look at these, how housing is acquired in our community, how much it costs, like it really is a very difficult thing. And that's not to mention that if someone's coming, coming into homelessness, likely for the same reasons, right? Maybe had an eviction, not able to pay their rent, and then was evicted, and then trying to they've lost everything. They're starting from fresh, and now they're, not only have whatever cost was incurred around the eviction, but also like the path forward to move that we just kind of looked at. I think, and I want to highlight this, and I think you talked about this, like just what toxic stress, right? And how families that are living, we talk a lot about trauma in our work and trauma-informed care and how trauma impacts people, particularly like adverse childhood experiences and bringing that with you. But we should understand toxic stress as trauma, right? And then people are asked to make decisions that will impact their livelihood in so many ways while living in, deep, stressful environment. And those decisions could be simple, right? Do I pay my rent or do I buy clothes for the school year? Do I have a birthday party, or do I, pay my car insurance? Do I fix my tire, or do I make sure, and these decisions are all interrelated to what people have to choose from. And so for folks that are living in poverty already, those decisions are impossible decisions that so many people have to make every year. And I think of one story, and like I think of the idea, like, how do you get affordable childcare, right? And how do you get the childcare voucher? And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is to actually get a childcare voucher, you have to work for 2 weeks and have a pay stub to be able to, and then you have to submit your pay stub to be able to qualify for a child. So what is the single mother going to do for the first 2 weeks that they're trying to work at, right? To be able to prove that. And so and I could just imagine the amount of stress someone would be under simply trying to get a job at a grocery store, a manufacturer, and trying to figure out childcare with absolutely no income just to be able to get childcare, right? It's but I think when we talk about homelessness, I think one of the things that I always want to talk about, and I think it blends into this, is that when we look at the data, right, and I think we talked a little bit about this, and the total population of Cuyahoga County and the total number of people living in poverty, but when we look at the homeless population specifically, it's in the county, it's around 7 sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I get my data right. Like 54% of the population live in poverty are Black, right? When you look at the homeless data, that disparity rises to 80%, right? 80% of the people that are experiencing homelessness in our community are Black, right? And so it begs the question, is like, why is that disparity so prevalent? And it invites us to also consider that it's not just about poverty, right? Like it's about race, and it's about systemic issues of racism that have wrought absolute havoc in our communities. And many of us probably know these things, right? Whether it's redlining in communities where, the Black community was prevented from home ownership, and, white people were given homes. And then it's, we've had big discussions around deed restrictions that, have prevented Black people from moving out of into communities, and then I think, some of the things, and so much of it actually comes back to like where we're at, right? Whether the history of deed restrictions in Shaker Heights itself, or whether it's like the zoning, how zoning was built in our country, right? That came from Euclid, Ohio. It's called Euclidean zoning, that built zoning codes to prevent poor people from moving into these communities, right? And so like this history is so part of like we're like the current location from which we talk about these things. But I think one of the things that I often want to like highlight is like how people that have like this idea of contract sales, right? In that, like in redlining, and even today, it's a handshake deal where you buy, it's a rent to own situation. And there was some really interesting studies that came out of Chicago when they looked at this idea of contract sales. And really it was, they did a study looking at Chicago and how much contract sales were sold, where, white homeowners signed a contract sale with a Black family and said, pay your rent for, pay us our mortgage, right? You can't get a bank loan because of redlining. Pay us a mortgage for 15 years, and you pay us $500 every month, and then in 15 years you'll own the home. And then with none of the protections of a mortgage or anything like that, after you paid for 10 years, you missed a payment, and the landlord said, like, sorry, like our contract is now null. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that in Chicago alone, like this young guy studied in Chicago from, I'm trying to find my notes here, sorry. actually can't find it now. That they, like, it was upwards, so out of Chicago alone in this 10, 12, 20-year period, it was estimated that around $4 billion worth of wealth was taken out of the hands of the Black community and put into the hands of the white community, just in Chicago alone, right? And so when we're talking about like, why does it cost so much to be poor, and why, you know, like, we have to look back in the history and being like, how was the money extracted or essentially stolen and put it into the hands? And that's why, like, race, because when we look at the data and the disparities, like, it is both a question of poverty, but it's really deeply a question about race and racism, systemic racism and structural racism in our community. And, you know, and that's what we see in the homeless system, right? We see it every day, right? When you're trying to get an apartment and they do a criminal background screening, right? Simply, like, we did a study over subsidized housing, right? You look at subsidized housing in our community, property-based Section 8, and you look at their look-back periods. What are they looking at for residents they want to have, right? And so you fill out an application, you pay, they do, you know, all these screenings, and then they do the criminal background screening. And around 90% of the low-income housing in our community, this is the permanent subsidized low-income housing in our community, does a lifetime look-back period for misdemeanor. This is for a misdemeanor, right? This isn't for a felony. It wasn't, you know, HUD gives two guidances. There's two people that are from the federal government that cannot live in permanently subsidized HUD subsidized buildings, and that is people that have been cooking methamphetamines in federal property and people that are on the sex registry list, right? If you have those two screenings, HUD says you can't live in our properties. Everything else is left to the property manager's discretion, right? So we can charge an application fee, we can, and then we'll criminal background screen your whole entire life for a misdemeanor. We actually had one guy that was applied to many different units looking for affordable housing, you know, really struggled with addiction back in the 80s, you know, from 85, like in 85 and 80, between 85 and 89, ended up getting sober, hasn't, you know, used anything since, applied to a building, they did looked at it, it said you were arrested in 85 for drug possession, and they said you can't live here, right? This is last year, right? This is how many years ago, and this guy has, you know, changed his life in so many ways, but that continues to prevent people from getting access to housing in every day in our work. And so I think that's a little bit, you know, I know I'm coming up on time, but I think, like, when we talk about these things, like, understanding that, you know, it's the majority of people that are experiencing homelessness in our community have jobs. They're working, they go to work, they don't make enough money, right? It's the same reason that they ended up homeless in the first place, right? It's that they don't have enough money, our housing costs are too high, and they're asked to make impossible decisions that and it doesn't work. The numbers don't add up. They have to make these decisions, and, you know, if one thing goes wrong, you know, you end up homeless, or, you know, and that I would say a couple really positive things just talking about that is cash. The solution to this is cash. If you look at these studies, there's been a lot of talk around direct cash transfer programs in our community. And that's really, like, and there was big studies out of Toronto, Canada, looking at, called the New Leaf Project, is what happens when you just give someone $10,000 cash. Like, what would happen, right? And so much of the stereotypes or everything we hear about what would happen if you gave someone experiencing homelessness $10,000 didn't happen, right? People were able to end their homelessness. They spent the money in the exact same data that we're seeing here with the tax credits, and they're able to solve their problems, right? That's with $10,000 cash. We did a direct cash transfer program just for $600, right, in the shelter system and for people that are unsheltered, right? We gave people, hey, if you can solve your homelessness for $600, you know, we would, you know, maybe you could commit to not coming back to the shelter for 3 months, right? And I was kind of like, we need to give them more money than that. $600 isn't a lot of money, right? What ended up happening is around 75% of the people that took that have never returned back to shelter, right? And so it is about, like, having resources to be able to solve your problems. Not that people aren't able, like almost everyone is able to solve their own problems if they just simply had the resources available to them. But we make systems that make it so hard to access. So I'm right on time.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you, Emily Campbell and Chris Knestrick. It's now time for our Q&A session. I guess,
Jan and Ellen will be passing the mic.
okay, we'll start with Mark. Who's got the mic?
Wait for the mic, so people at home can hear.
Somebody on this side waiting for the mic. Mark.
Thank you both for a very interesting presentation. Could you speak a little bit to the sort of geography of poverty? And I'm thinking of it in just, for example, you're living in finally in an apartment that you can barely, but you can sort of afford. And then the big name supermarket closes for corporate reasons and moves, and you're stuck with buying your food at convenience stores.
Mhm.
Now, this could be repeated, but if you could talk a little bit about that, it would help me. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. So when we think about, that's not where I thought you were going, so I'm going to answer the question you didn't ask first. When we think about the geography of poverty, we do see concentrations of poverty in Cleveland and in Cuyahoga County. A lot of those are frankly in the very same areas that were redlined in the 1930s and 1940s for those overtly racist policies. And in fact, Cleveland has not moved on from our legacy of redlining in ways that other cities have. Brookings found that there were 4 cities that were particularly had particular concentrations of racial concentrations, and were not diverse communities, and Cleveland was one of them. Atlanta, Detroit, can't remember the 4th, but Cleveland was one of them. So when we think about, housing is place-based, right? You are where you are, and looking for a place that has the amenities that you need, that has the things that you can get. We see people making some of those tough choices and investing more of their own resources into housing to get themselves into a better school district, for example, or a place that has lower crime, and those things come with expense. There's a reason that the property values are increasing in some communities, and it's because of the amenities that are there. But these things aren't always stuck and situated. So to your point, yes, you can move someplace because it's walking distance to a full service grocery store. If that grocery store closes, you've got to figure out something else. And there's no one there to help you try and figure that out. And so this isn't a problem that you solve once and it's over. It's a problem that people living on the edge and with limited resources have to solve for themselves over and over again. And it might be that the issue is different this month than it is next month. Childcare is another. I've talked a lot about childcare, but childcare places are also closing, changing their hours. Your work can change the hours that they're scheduling you. The bus routes can change. We've seen that a lot in this community over the last decade or so, with bus routes changing and time changing, and what you had figured out doesn't work anymore. And so, these are things that it is a lot easier to solve any of these problems if you have the resources to be glib, to throw money at the problem. People don't. And so they end up coming up with all different kinds of solutions that work varying levels of well to try and make things work for themselves. And it ends up costing them more. I mean, we've talked a lot over several years about payday loans, and a lot of people don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. They need the resources today, and they recognize what it's going to cost them, but they don't have any other option but to do that. And so, as Chris was saying, people who are struggling, who are navigating these systems, have an incredible ability to work things out for themselves, but they don't always have the kind of choices that we would like them to have. And so it's not about making bad decisions. It's about the decisions that you're presented with.
I would just add on top of that, one thing is that like, the housing choice voucher program here and it's kind of like for a family that is living below the poverty line, it is a really big deal, right? There's thousand, they give around $10,000 a year, that 60,000 people apply for the housing choice voucher. This is the voucher that goes with the family and you can use, and the idea is you can go to a neighborhood of opportunity, that you could send your kids to, where they would have grocery stores that are in walking distances, or they would have the schools that all of us would want to send our kids to. And what we've seen is that, when you go to use that voucher, you see a sign that says no Section 8 welcomed here, right? No Eden welcomed here. And that really what we see in Cleveland is, and through this vouchers program, is that they continue to only find landlords that will rent to them in this historically redlined communities, right? And so it was some really interesting data that came out of the youth and young adult work to end homelessness, was like, where are we sending young people to live, right? These are 18 to 24-year-olds that have a voucher, are looking for a job, maybe going to school, and almost entirely sent to historically red-lined neighborhoods, because that was the only place they could find a landlord that would rent to them. And that means that they don't have access, easily access to groceries. Maybe they do, maybe they're next to Dave's, or, I think they're, but like that is part of the conversation, is like, the systemic issues and discrimination that continues to happen in communities. You can't, even to be able to use those vouchers, a gift that would actually offer you the opportunity to is like becomes more and more difficult.
Thank you.
I had a question and a comment. Our church is starting a program to provide pretrial services for people in Cuyahoga County. And one of the things that we know is that oftentimes when people are in jail, before they get released on their own recognizance or through other means, they lose their jobs, they may lose their homes. Basically, they have nothing left. And oftentimes the judge will say, well, if you have a place to go, we'll let you out. So what can Cuyahoga County and your program say to help these people? Do you have any programs that would provide that immediate kind of care that they need just to get established again?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of amazing work happening out of like, when we're talking about justice housing and justice involved initiatives. Our organization has someone that is working with us to actually have people that have been previously incarcerated lead that work, right? So like for us, it's like the question of like, who leads the work, right? Who knows deeply in their bones, like what folks need coming out. And so, we've worked with the Cuyahoga County Reentry Committee to really form a committee of people directly impacted to kind of, I know they just released an 8-point plan around this conversation. And I think there's some really exciting work coming out. That doesn't solve your problem, right? But like in terms of policy and stuff, I think there's some really great initiatives and work happening directly from people that are and so, clearly justice, that conversation, I think for me, it's like, I'm thinking about, you need an ID, right? That is worth thinking. How do you get an ID, right? You have to have your birth certificate, right? How much does a birth certificate cost to get? $25, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. You can't get an ID without a birth certificate, but you can't get a birth certificate without a social security card, but you can't get a social security card without an ID.
Oh,
So yeah, like it's like, it becomes a cycle, right? And that's very difficult. But the fundamental thing is it all costs money,
Yeah.
right? And for someone that's coming right out of, they don't, and so I think that's something I know places like Oriana House and in our community are doing. So like, I think if you look at who's getting the most IDs, like because we have an ID crisis collaborative in our community that's providing free IDs and free birth certificates to solve this problem. I mean, they're one of the groups that use it, more than any other. But I think that simple thing is like, that's a problem, right? That's even before you fill out an application, try to find housing, you know? And so I don't know if I answered your question appropriately, but that's kind of the, I think when I think about our work, when we're like, that's where like we're kind of looking at long-term solutions, like what are the real solutions, and deeply believing that has to come from people that have lived experience and are directly impacted. And that, it starts from the very beginning, and yeah, this idea, like when you're criminal background screenings, right? I mean, you could apply to move into any of these, permanently subsidized properties, but you're never done a path to criminal background screening to be able to get into them. And so many of folks, end up going, if they're lucky, they have a family and friend that will say yes. I'm sure that's probably where most people end up. And if you're not, you end up in, the homeless system.
Yeah.
Or you rot in a cage, right? For no reason.
Yeah. For our organization, one of the things that we're probably going to do some work on is around Medicaid and people who are incarcerated. So right now, the rule is the moment you're incarcerated, you lose your Medicaid coverage and you can't get it back until you're released. The problem is that so many people who end up incarcerated have mental health issues, have addiction issues, have other, health issues that they're dealing with. And so thinking about a pilot program to enable our local government to cover people with Medicaid for 90 days before release, to sort of start so that they can establish some of those patterns of stability before they're walking out the door. And the problem is that the rules are written so that it doesn't matter how long you're incarcerated. You can be incarcerated for 2 days, you still lose it, and you have to go back through the process. Which it is not an instantaneous process to get back on. Even if before you were receiving the benefit, you still have to reapply to get back on, and so causes a lot of problems. So there's a lot of things built into these systems that don't work well for anyone, that are expensive for the systems and for the people. And so our organization is trying to find those places where we can make some, I'll call them relatively simple changes. That doesn't mean that they're simple to get enacted, but to change some things to make it work better in the way that the general public imagines they do work. Great questions.
Yes, can you speak to violence and abuse connection in poverty, in particular the struggles of women trying to flee situations, and having that struggle financially to try to get out, and they end up being stuck because that's the only extra money that they're getting?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start, and then Chris, I'm sure you have a little bit more. I'll talk very quickly. Yes, I mean, that is one of the areas of trauma that we often see, that go along with some of these challenges, and being able to control money, even if the person is working and earning their own money, part of abuse is often that control that comes with the control of cash, that they don't have the resources. The good news is that there are programs that are specific for those circumstances, recognizing that usually it's the woman, not always, but that the woman is leaving with nothing and needs something immediately, and a safe place to go, and a safe place to go where they can't be found very quickly, is something that our community is starting to build up. But then what happens after a few weeks, after the immediate challenge is resolved? Unfortunately, a lot of people who are victims of intimate partner violence go back. They go back because of the challenges of being able to rebuild an entire life when you're leaving with nothing.
Yeah, I mean, economic, like, control of someone economically is clearly part of the domestic violence, the wheel of power and control. I'm thinking back of the last time I saw who is entering into family homelessness, and this is actually a system that is not specific, recognizes that many people will come fleeing domestic violence, but is not created to serve directly people that are fleeing gender-based and domestic violence. But it's around 50% of the families that typically end up in the family shelter are for this reason. I know that it is so prevalent in our community that like oftentimes our DV shelters are full, in fact, right? There are specific like dollars for rehousing survivors and stuff, but it's not enough, right? And so I think there's the Center for Journey for Healing, and there's that is doing amazing work on this front and has been leading the way. But I think like it's once again like it's not enough, based on the people that need that resource. I think in line with that, I think one of the things I'll end there before I get into something different.
Hi, I'm just wondering how, situations where, a person isn't a US citizen, how that impacts, the situation, the availability of help to them, how, support for immigrants may, hinder community or support or policy change, things like that. So how does that complicate, and, what is being done can be done to help the situation?
Yeah. It is very difficult in our community, right? I think, our shelters will serve anyone that comes to them, it doesn't matter what your status is. So like you can get like access to the emergency crisis shelters, right? But I think what we find is that it's so much more difficult to get out of those situations when people are coming here, right? I think in this conversation, there's like two different things, right? There's like the conversation around like refugee status, which is very different than like, migrant, like asylum seekers, right? And what resources you have available to you. And I think what we often see is that migrants or people seeking asylum come here, felt like they had family tie here that maybe failed and stuff like that, and then they're looking to stay here and stuff. And those services, in my experience, are very hard to come by. That really, and it's the folks that are working on those front lines are oftentimes churches like this, grassroots organizations that are really trying to do some mutual aid stuff to support people. But I as far as like, I think if you come as under refugee status, there's a whole host of like a new welcome center that's just set up in our community and stuff like that. But it's really the folks that are coming as asylum seekers and have found their way here for like, more of like on their personal way, that those resources are just so hard to come by. Like I'm thinking, but no, it's always like, people's identities are very complicated, right? I'm thinking of a migrant asylum seeker that came here that is a trans person, right? And like, was fleeing trans violence and from Guatemala and ended up, in the United States and found themselves in Cleveland. And then it's like, you're coming here and like, you're facing transphobia and violence, both, all over, whether, you can come here and you can identify how you want and you get to go to the shelter of your choice. But the people, there's transphobic as the rest of our society, right, is. And so they're facing that type of violence there with, and are trying to access services that aren't built for them, right? They're built on a binary. They're, and then they also have this whole other side of that they're undocumented. And so, typical services, whether it's like a PSH or affordable housing, isn't available to them because they don't have, citizenship. So, and so I think like some of our experiences have specifically been working with people that identify as trans that just don't have those resources that have that and undocumented that like, so it's, the barriers are multiplied by 1,000.
I have a question from our Zoom audience. Yesterday, I attended the Poor People's Campaign demonstration in Columbus. They said that poverty is the 4th cause of death in the United States, and that 800 people die daily from poverty. One woman testified that her husband died after being turned away from the hospital for lack of the $35 fee, and he died the next day. Testimonies were reaching. Please comment on this campaign.
Yeah, that is a statistic that I hadn't heard before, about poverty being the fourth most common cause of death, but frankly, it's not surprising. It's not surprising because we see the layers of disadvantage that people are struggling with every day. Here in Greater Cleveland, well, in Ohio, one of my former colleagues, Kate Warren, did some research looking at life expectancy by census tract across the whole state. And what she found was a 23 year difference in the amount of time someone can expect to live in a census tract that's just outside of University Circle and one that is actually not that far from here in Shaker Heights, just 2 miles apart. 23 years, just 2 miles apart. And the difference has to do with so many of the things that we've already talked about today, right? And so when you think about outcomes, right, the ultimate outcome is premature mortality. People who aren't living as long as they could, who aren't living in circumstances that are positive, and it's an early death. And so one of the things that we work on a lot is awareness, is conversations like this, is talking about what are the realities that people are facing, is talking about what are the systems that aren't set up to help people or that aren't helping people in ways that we would hope that they would. But it's a real struggle. And when I first was working on these issues and going around the state talking about poverty, I used to say that poverty is complicated. It's not. It's really simple. It's about a lack of resources. Now, how that manifests in people's lives are very complicated. The barriers that people face are very complicated. The ways that perhaps we get out of the issues or the things that we need to address in order to get on a different path may be complicated, but it's really a very simple problem. The thing is, if it were easy, or if it were fast, or if it were politically palpable, or if it were affordable, we would have already solved these problems. But I see a lot of hope in some of the things that Chris was talking about and what I talked about in stopping. We realize that we shouldn't just dabble around the edges. We can get to the core of the problem. We can get there pretty quickly if we're looking at more resources for people. CAT, not being sort of the nanny state that we hear about and telling people you're deserving, you're not deserving. Getting beyond that to allow people to have the resources to be able to address the problems that they're facing in their lives. And I'll say that a couple years ago, we did some research with Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, with Cleveland Legal Aid, and with the legal aid that's out of the Akron-Canton area. And we asked people, even decades after their association with legal aid, what changed in your life? And what we heard time after time is that it didn't matter whether the case was decided in their favor. It didn't matter what their case was for. That having that issue addressed allowed them to move forward in their lives in lots of other ways. So even if their cases didn't have anything to do with health, they said their health was better once it was resolved, positive or negative. And so we know that stability is so important. Housing is such a fundamental piece of stability that's why we have housing first campaigns, that's one of the first things we need to have in order for people to be able to take care of things in their lives.
And just to quickly comment, like the Poor People's Campaign, I think it's really powerful. Like, we're part of the Poor People's Campaign at the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. I think the reality is that, the history of the United States is built on social movements and people demanding what they want, right? The civil rights movement, the passing of the Fair Housing Act, like all of these things happened because of mass mobilization and people pushing their elected officials, not just through meetings, but through direct action in other ways. And I think, on our end, I don't know about the data. I think I only spoke to that well, but I do know that the social movements are what move us forward to a more just society. And I think Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign is really trying to galvanize that in a new way and really bringing back some of the work Dr. Martin Luther King did in the Poor People's Movement. And so I think that's really powerful. And I think we should all participate in that where and how we're able, because the reality is like, I think even the most meaning and like heart-filled politicians need to be pushed, right? To be able to move stuff forward, because that is the reality. And so like, none of this work will change without like really grassroots mass mobilization.
Well, thank you. Appreciate so much, this forum. Question, you mentioned that poverty is not really complex.
Uh-huh.
The question that I have is, poverty has been around since forever, and it obviously benefits some people.
Mhm.
And without an analysis of who it benefits, why it benefits, and then how do you change that around? So I'd like you to address that. Because obviously it would be extinct if it did not benefit. Thank you very much.
I really like something that Chris said earlier, and I wrote it down about the resources that get extracted from communities. And I think we know who these things benefit. And just one example, I was talking with a colleague this week, and we were talking about Medicaid managed care plans. These are the companies that are brought in to provide to be the insurer for people who are on Medicaid, the health insurance that government provides for low-income people and those with disabilities. And for the first time, the state of Ohio is requiring that those companies that are for-profit, they're all for-profit, reinvest some of their profits back into the community in some very specific ways. Well, surprise, surprise, the amount that's available is much less than what was estimated to be available, because there's an incentive to do the accounting different ways. And what my colleague had said is that, there's some discomfort that we have in this work because we're profiting on the backs of poor people. Who we're actually profiting on the backs of are taxpayers. It's taxpayers who are fitting the bill. It's poor people that get poor services. And so those are some of the things that are in play. And it all comes down to the money and who's profiting and the power. And there are political incentives to separate people and to present things as racial issues when they're really economic issues or poverty related issues. That's happened historically over time. And there are certainly ways that people keep power and keep profit, that the taxpayers foot the bill. The people who are struggling are the ones that suffer.
And maybe I would just say a couple of things. Like, I think some of the stuff that the study out of Chicago is like white people clearly benefited, right? Like that is the history of like racism and in our community, and like the privilege and generational wealth that was built off of that, right? That's one example. I think when we talk about who benefits, I think it brings, actually this is going way back in my work in Colombia, and I worked with a small community that was displaced from their land and were trying to reclaim their land there, right? And they, were threatened with death, and the history of Colombia, and I don't want to get all into that, but this community, Las Pavas community, they were farmers, right? And they wanted their land to simply like sustainably farm their land, right? And a multinational palm company came and took their land from them, right? And planted palm and said, hey, you're going to benefit from this. You can work a wage job now on the palm plantation and you'll get money. And they were like, no, that's not what we want, right? But like, who benefits from that is, the multinational corporations, the profit shares and all of that. And so like in that conversation, in like global capitalism, like it's clearly seen, right? And that we like tell people that they'll benefit from this system that we've set up, and it won't, right? Like they're like, that's actually, we know we won't benefit from that, because then we'll have to work the rest of their lives. Our kids, our grandkids will all have to be wage, when we can just, this is our land, we own it, and we could actually sustain here for the rest forever if you just allow us to. But that's not what global capitalism wants, right? They don't want subsistence farmers that can live forever on their land and be happy doing that, right? But I think likewise, like the conversation around who benefits is really the right question, right? And why have we created this system that you know, benefits so many, so little people, right? Like, sorry, and like leaves, you know, impoverishes so many, whether, you know, and I think when we're talking about Amazon and who became billionaires during COVID, right? And who died, like it's clear who benefits. And that, you know, but like, yeah, so I would just kind of say that I think it's a really poignant question, and that we need to be reminded of, like, there are people that are benefiting from this, right?
Hi, one question, just one, point of reference. It says that the federal minimum wage has kept pace with workers' productivity since 1968, the inflation adjusted minimum wage would be $24 an
Yeah.
hour. So the fact that we accept as a, culture, the ridiculous minimum wage that we have right now is just astounding to me. But here's my question. I was talking with some folks this week about, we were talking about people returning from incarceration, that there's some kind of a certificate of qualification that they can apply for, that then if they are employed by an employer, the employer can't be sued, because that's what employers are so scared about with, you know, hiring people with records that something's going to happen and they're going to be financially culpable. Can you talk about that? It sounds to me like, from what this person was saying, that first of all, very few people know about it, and employers, when they're presented with it, have no idea what it is, and so it's irrelevant. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that you can get the certificate, but you got to find an employer that accepts it as for what it is. So yes, I've heard of those programs, maybe not that specific one, but some of them, it's getting it to be widely accepted. And I know we're at time as well. So sort of the last piece of this, I think, is that we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And government budgets are moral documents where we show what our priorities are. And so it's thinking about things in that way. What are the best solutions with the limited resources that we all have, and that government has, and that every organization has, is really the key to it. And that solutions can come from lots of different places, but we've got to cobble them all together in order to have a system that really works.
Thank you, Emily, and yes, that was outstanding. I have some questions myself, but I'm the coordinator and I'm not supposed to do that. So, our next 9 a.m. forum will be making end-of-life decisions. What are the options in Ohio? With speakers Ann Rowland, retired assistant U.S. attorney, and Lisa Vigil Schattinger, founder of Ohio End-of-Life Options. And Susan Alcorn wanted to add that she has some literature on this topic, but you can approach her personally about that.
I have several books here that can be good background information for this discussion. But secondly, if you are not on our email list and will want to attend this one and some of our other ones, I have the sign-in sheet where we can get your email address and we'll get reminders of upcoming ones.
If you'd like to receive our weekly reminders of forums, fill out the form on the clipboard as back table. You are welcome to attend our 10:15 a.m. Sunday service, either upstairs or in the sanctuary or on your YouTube page. The theme today is Nourishing Our Spiritual Home with Reverend Randy Parting on the pulpit. Today's music will feature our chancel choir. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us and have a great week.